Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter, and today I am really very excited and delighted to be joined by Catherine O'Halloran from Limerick City Build. Hi Catherine, how are you?
Hi Jane, I'm good. I'm more excited and delighted, I think, to be here. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, we've lots to talk about because we've already had a chat before, and I am really, thrilled to get your perspective as a practitioner in this area. But before we get into it, can you tell me a bit about yourself, Catherine, and your background?
Sure. And I'll try to keep it as short as possible. So I suppose I'm a psychotherapist, the CEO of Limerick City Build. I've just embarked on a PhD research, but I suppose my kind of obsession really is around working, has always been about trying to engage and work with men on the margins of society. And I suppose, like all stories, mine starts with feeling like I was on the margins of society at one time in my early experience. So I think that has definitely informed the career path and academic path that I've been on, and laid down a very kind of deeply implicit and heavily integrated experience of kind of empathy for people who are on the very, very far fringes of society.
Okay.
And finding ways really to engage them and offer something through that engagement. In terms of my academic kind of career, I began studying architecture, then very quickly moved into psychology. So studied in a very clinical way. I studied psychology, then developmental psychology, went on to look more specifically at addiction, and then I suppose that kind of yearning in me to do more relational work drew me then into psychotherapy training, which spanned 6 years of my my training lasted. And I suppose in all of that then, in parallel to that, I had been working in the community development sector, in the kind of industry of poverty that was created in Limerick at the time, and worked in lots of different capacities. But I suppose my passions were all around the power of group work. So what happened, the magic that could happen in a facilitated space, not being aware, I suppose, initially of what was happening for me or why that was very special, but knowing that something very powerful could happen in dealing with the collective. And, you know, there was always definitely a passion and an awareness there that communities in Limerick had experienced a very collective trauma that everybody shared. And if we were really to tackle this in a way that made significant headway and change, we needed to acknowledge and work that into the models that we were using at the time. And I suppose then that led me to kind of pulling away and developing something pretty different. And the kind of beginnings of the ideas for Limerick City Build grew from that, kind of grew from the frustration that, you know, what now after you work with someone, you know, and they age out of youth provision, like, you know, what now after you go through a really intensive family systems kind of program with a family, and, you know, there was just always that question of what now for the community after we provide the interventions that have a very tight frame. You know, what do they do with that capacity building? And so that's what Limerick City Build really, the intention was to answer that kind of question and offer something that could be lasting.
So tell me then what Limerick City Build actually is, and what does it seek to achieve for the men who engage with the program, really, or it's lots of different things. So give us an overview of where it started and where it's now.
So we started around 2014, and really it was a kind of a place where men could, like, you know, it was all about how do men who, you know, are still maybe in substance abuse or misuse, have maybe just exited prison, are still very, very vulnerable and very raw in terms of their state, but present with a desire to change.
Yeah.
Where can they go to have conversations about their future that will be taken seriously?
Lovely.
Where they won't, you know, we need to get you clean first, and we need to get, you know, we need to engage in an abstinence-based program, or, you know, so all of the limitations that I had worked within, I wanted to kind of remove and just pilot a way of working with men that could support their actualization, their purpose, wherever that might lead them to. And yeah, very quickly we realized that that needed to be heavily trauma informed.
Okay.
And that, you know, for men, most of their aspirations were around work. And I suppose the model that we developed here then is that rather than work being something that, you know, is, you know, a power holder, you know, holds outside of them, and that one day they'll be ready for it.
Okay.
That we actually really encourage and cultivate startup ideas, engagement in social enterprise, so they become the masters of their own destiny and cultivate their own legacy. So that's really kind of, and it was a real high bar of aspiration at the time, but yeah, that was really the kind of the raw idea that we began with.
And you came in and chatted to my colleagues and myself at UL and the rep team a few weeks back, and were telling us that, you know, right from the get-go, you wanted Limerick City Build to be trauma-informed and gender-specific. Why are those things important?
Well, I think to really understand how trauma impacts an individual, the particular adaptations that individual, either male or female, typically take up. You know, the research tells us that how men experience trauma is very, very different, actually. Where they hold it in their body is very, very different. The processes for healing that they might need, their needs, their are very, very different. And I suppose what we wanted to do was create a space that felt safe for men, and safety for men feel is, you know, the criteria for that as they set it looks very, very different than the criteria for women. I think it's worth noting as well that when you're dealing with communities who are very, very deprived, where their basic needs aren't met, you know, very traditional gender roles get laid down and cemented. Yeah. So, you know, the kind of progressive expression of masculinity, they never really get there because, you know, because of fear, intimidation, violence, grown up in those environments, very highly traumatic environments. Their masculinity, you know, often it's indistinguishable from the adaptations of trauma. Yeah.
And is that now, I mean, I dislike the phrase toxic masculinity myself. It's very common, but I think it misses the fact that many of the things, the indicators of that type of behavior or being in the world are actually trauma responses.
Absolutely, yeah. And you know, we can, you know, really encourage men in our world to embrace their femininity, but they don't have a sense of their own masculinity yet.
Yeah.
You know, they have absolutely no idea what their true self would have been if this, you know, highly defended, hyper masculine facade wasn't built up to protect them. So what we're asking them to do is kind of take away everything that keeps them safe. So you know, we allow them to keep that intact for a while. But at the same time, you know, the work is about slowly and gently and in a very general way, helping them to understand how that happens, for not just for men, for all of us.
Yeah.
How a center, how a sense of I gets developed, and how that is a literal reflection and mirroring of, you know, all of the external feedback that they get as in a very, very early kind of, you know, 0 to 2 state. So it's deeply imprinted in us, you know, it's a very non-verbal imprinting. And so, you know, that kind of creates a curiosity then about, okay, maybe there wasn't necessarily, you know, part of who I am, but it was just part of what I learned, you know,
Yes.
in a way to navigate through a very, very unsafe world that I exist in.
And I'm sure you've met men now who've kind of come to that realization of that wasn't me. That was a lot of adaptations or maladaptive strategies to get through all the fear and torment and social rejection and various other things that made just living very difficult. Because
Yeah.
I certainly have met a few men who might have done some quite violent things and, you know, really were they described themselves as maybe being a bit terrifying to know at various points. But when they've got psychoeducation around stress and trauma and attachment and safety and survival responses, they then end up being able to talk in such a beautiful and vulnerable way. It's really kind of remarkable. Have you encountered that yourself, Catherine?
Yeah, and there's something really spiritual about when someone reveals their true self, not just to you, but to themselves, maybe
Yeah,
for the first time, and you're in their presence. It's like, you know, it is, you get the chills, really,
yeah,
don't you, when you hear it? And I think added to that is when men get together in a group and can do
yes,
that. So most of the men that come through our program would have, if you read just their profile on paper, you might be a little bit intimidated. But
right.
underneath all of that is a common experience of absolute terror and fear.
Mm.
And really, when men can collectively acknowledge the fear that they experienced, I mean, that's a beautiful piece of work to witness, because
Yeah.
then we're in a place of presence and truth then.
Mm.
And it's very rare that those spaces exist for them.
Yes.
And they might only exist here, and so they might need to put back on the armor and zip it right up, and, you know, because it isn't safe for them to go back in that very raw state. And slowly and slowly and slowly, that kind of consciousness raising will happen the more work you do. And that's why I always, you know, bang the drum for, you know, all these programs need to be, you know, unlimited in terms of their timeline, because you
Yes.
cannot put the minute we restrict sessions time, you know, by saying, you know, we can only have 6 of these group sessions, that's it. You know, people, you know, they've opted out already, because it means you won't be there for me, you
Well,
know.
that's right. And if we're asking people to do this deep, painful work of realization, maybe, and stripping off some of the defenses, then they do need holding.
Yeah.
But to ask you a bit more about the group work, Fritzi Horseman is a woman who set up the Compassion Prison Project. I'm sure you're familiar with her work. And as
One of my idols.
amazing, yeah, she is. And I wanted her to come to the Irish Prison Service, but they were kind of like, oh, you know, it's not really safe to do that type of work in prison, and perhaps it's not. But I witnessed her do it with women prisoners. And
Yeah.
like that now, I can only imagine the group spaces where, like, energetically people shift in quite a short period of time, sometimes, you know, with the knowledge that trauma does these things to all of us if we experience it, or it can do, or these are the ways we can adapt. And then also some of the just the group work exercises of, there was one called The Gold I See in You, where people went around, everyone in the group said something nice about the women in the center. And it was like, it was really powerful and beautiful thing to
Yeah.
witness,
So
particularly when people may never have had anything really nice said to them
it's
along the
their
way.
first experience of someone actually being in an embodied present state to their pain ever.
Yeah.
And, you know, that can be difficult for them to kind of hold themselves in that space. But if you keep showing up in that way, you know, inevitably their kind of energy will come to kind of acclimate to that culture that you're trying to create collectively. And there's, you know, I think in terms of the group work, the minute we make a declaration as a group that, you know, we're here with an intention to heal, to feel better in ourselves, in our bodies, to just feel better about being in the world, so that we're not suffering, something very, very powerful happens just by making that declaration together.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing?
It is. And so there's that process, you know, element to the group where you're tracking through your own body what's happening for somebody else. And that's, you know, you really need a kind of keen sense of your own internal senses.
Yes.
But then there's also the psychoeducational piece, which is really, really important, that people understand the why. Why has this happened to me? What has gone on in me? Let's look at the brain. So it's not just my brain. So the shame then begins to lift. And that can free us up then to engage in the process work with a little bit more fluidity.
Yes, there's a lady I was speaking to the other day called Sue Cushion, who is a trauma survivor herself and does amazing work as a foster carer. But she strongly believes in psychoeducation for anyone, you know, anyone who's human, really, because we don't know what people are carrying. And she says the shame melts away. Once you get this information, the shame melts away. Have you experienced that sometimes with some of the men in the groups?
And I think for men, you know, shame is a really heavy, you can see it physically being carried in their bodies. Because, you know, we grow up in a world where men are, you know, the builders of our world. They build the built environment. They are meant to be the providers. Their role is to carry, you know, the torch for the family, for the community, for society. They're meant to be on the front lines. They're meant to fight the fight. And so when they feel like they missed that mark, and they missed that mark essentially by being dropped into a pre-traumatized world, so they could never meet it, then, you know, they for all of their lives feel just that deep shame in their core. It's really, really deeply carried. And so that takes a lot of work to recognize what it is and to discharge the energy of that, which I think for men is really important.
And we might come back to that in a second about the kind of physical dimension of the work, because it's construction work. But in setting up Limerick City Build, did you find then, and do you find now, that policymakers and politicians and the like and other services get the significance of trauma?
At the time, Jane, no one was talking about it at the time. So I know it's a kind of a buzzword now, and you know, there's lots of organizations, you know, that do a weekend training and say, you know, we're trauma informed too. But you know, on a kind of high level, you know, when you're dealing with kind of you know, the holders of, you know, resources for organizations like ours, there is an absolute kind of mystifying ignorance around it, and a very conscious rejection of that from the conversation, is my experience. And I think that's combined with being a woman introducing this topic, because it's so it's reduced to kind of sentimentality,
being a bit soft, a bit kind of overly forgiving.
And all of that feeling stuff, you know. How many people are going to go out to work after this program is really which is really objectifying and abusive, because you know, again, it's, you know, trauma is all about power, and again, these are the people that hold the power, and basically what they're saying is that your only value, your client's only value, is to go out and, you know, be productive in some mediocre job without any sense of purpose, without any sense of kind of true kind of creativity that kind of drives their decision making. It's just, you know, really objectified, which I can struggle with at times.
Yeah, and why do you think that is? Is it because they need to find various metrics, or
Yeah.
answer to the politicians that, you know, as you say, you're only valuable if you work? And actually, probably a lot of the public also believe that, you know, if they are more privileged and have had a good start in life and went to school and could learn and go to college and get jobs, there often are these unforgiving attitudes to the people on the margins that they're choosing not to do it. They could go to work if they wanted. And so if they don't, if they go through a program like this and don't go on out the other side into some job or set up their own company, that it's somehow a failure. What do you think is at the root of that kind of
There's a
thinking
couple
and
of
feeling?
things, I think. Definitely, you know, kind of ignorance around, you know, people's experience and the reality of what it's like growing up in communities that are like the most deprived in Europe. Like, that's definitely there. I think there's another piece where people are terrified to acknowledge the importance of it because, you know,
Of
for us,
trauma, you mean, is it?
yeah, I
Yeah.
think, you know, for anyone working in an organization or, you know, for our staff, it is more important that we understand our own trauma, that we understand the territory of that. Where was the kind of terrain? What was it that we took, the journey it took for us to uncover, unpack, and heal some of the fractured parts of ourselves?
Uh-huh.
That is a vital piece in this. We cannot facilitate the work unless we've done that in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, on a very unconscious level, can kind of produce a resistance to this subject.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yes,
at
I
the core of
agree.
it, I think that's it.
Yeah, I've encountered that as well, that investment in denial, you know, even that is a trauma response too, to go, not me, or I'm not a mental health professional. I can't go near this. We can't open the can of worms. Will cause further harm or whatever else. So it's a great point that that if you're not aware of your own story or your own attachment history, your own lack of safety at various points, you're going to also, with power as well, be very much prone to traumatic reenactment, I imagine, if you're unaware.
So you have anyone who grows up in the society, you know, in the current kind of cultural climate is disembodied.
Right.
Just by virtue of how we live. You know, we
Mm-hmm.
have remote conversations, we're on a device all the time, you know, we obsess over career and academia, which are all kind of, you know,
Top
uh,
level.
yeah. And so what we're asking, well, not what we're asking, what we're experiencing is people who are traumatized making policy level decisions about people who are traumatized.
Yeah.
So there's an irony in it, you know.
Yeah.
So and look, that's, you know, the way it is.
Mm.
But what we would hope for is that there would be a little window of curiosity in there, just a small one, for people who have really seemed to mastered something that is proven to work, where we can have a voice that contributes to the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And so who do you kind of hire at Limerick City Build? Given that
Uh,
this is special work, you know,
it is. But like every Friday, we like to do a kind of 2 hour training session, get
okay.
somebody new in to give us just refresh our ideas on it. And it doesn't matter what your background is. You do not need to be like a psychotherapist. You don't need to
Okay.
have, you know, people come from a variety of backgrounds who work here. You know, many of them from the communities that we target, which is
Okay.
great. But I suppose the onus is on me as the manager of the organization to make sure we're providing spaces, regardless if what level of duty they have here,
Mm-hmm.
that they really understand the model, and that I'm consistently providing spaces and training and education for everyone across the board. So that even on a philosophical level, people get it.
Yeah.
Even if their contact time with the clients is limited. I think, yeah, and that's really, really important to me. You know, it's interesting when we work with really profound levels of trauma and people come in and the most unsafe thing for them is a safe environment, because all they want is, you know, a stimulus, external stimulus that's louder than the internal chaos, right?
What an
And so
amazing
what
way
we
to put it.
really, yeah, so what we really need to watch out for, and that's why, you know, we always have a Friday morning kind of meet, is about how have we been pulled into that? Because the tendency is, unless we're really keenly and acutely aware and embodied ourselves,
Yeah,
that
they'll
we
pull
will,
you in.
the trauma will run the show.
Yeah.
Which is happening in so many organizations, that, you know, you spend all your time drinking tea and rehearsing traumatic events that have happened in people's lives, and we see that as intimacy. We see that as actually, you know, a really measure of quality and trust, when it's the absolute opposite. So I have to watch out for that with a really, really keen eye. And oftentimes, you know, we get it wrong and we put ourselves back and we ask ourselves, what was that really about? So, and in that sense, I would say that, you know, being a trauma-informed organization is a massive undertaking.
It is.
And I think that can be just a little bit underappreciated at times, that people see it just as, oh, I understand what trauma does. So, you know.
Yeah, when I was doing my PhD, I really liked Sandy Bloom's book, Creating Sanctuary, and where she was talking about the living learning environments and kind of trying to flatten the model as well, so that it wasn't super hierarchical. And that, I suppose as well, like, we live in a blaming, shaming world, and we love to blame our systems and find someone to throw under the bus when bad things happen. But isn't it important as well, like you were talking there, that you do reflect, because we can all get things wrong. We all have our own stress response systems, our families, our stressors that make us less than we might like to be at a given time. And as you say, the trauma runs the show, so it has an interest in reproducing the same dynamics that have always been there. And so that if we are off on a given day, we might be not aggressive maybe, or we might shout a little bit, or we might have a cross face, or be rejecting or abandoning. And it is important to then make repair, isn't it, Catherine?
Absolutely. And it's not about being perfect models of human beings. It's about saying, what happened between us there, you know, because, you know, the kind of common kind of consequence of this can be that the staff turn against each other, or there's conflict with staff, because there might have been conflict in every home. So that's kind of, I get mom and dad to fight with each other, and then, so it's what's happening between us, and constantly checking in, and then even bringing some of the clients into that conversation. So that they know, regardless what happens, we support each other at a very basic. No matter what, the staff are always going to be on the same page. And if we deviate, we will repair. If we get it wrong, we'll hold our hands up in honesty and say, I'm so sorry, we really didn't listen there, and we should have caught that. And like, you know, there's a million of different scenarios where we've had to kind of, you know, tweak things, evolve the program, say we've missed something here, which is really important. And thankfully, I've remained, you know, with the kind of autonomy as an organization that I can allow for some of that fluidity in the model, which I think is very, very important for supervision to actually have meaning in terms of the reflection. You need that fluidity.
Yeah, I agree with you. And oftentimes in this space, particularly in the criminal justice space, the supervision is about case management supervision. So how many clients do you have? How many meetings did you have? Did you do the LSIR? Why didn't you repeat the LSIR after X amount of meetings, rather than that interpersonal stuff? Or how are you getting on? Do you actually, can you stand that guy? Like sometimes isn't it more trauma informed to have someone else work with someone if that dynamic
Yeah,
is
or even
working?
understand, okay, is there a transference happening here? Is it a counter transference, which is such an interesting phenomenon?
Mm.
And once someone really gets that, wow, I'm actually playing out the role of their mother, and
Yeah.
I had absolutely no idea why I was responding from a place that didn't feel authentic in me.
Yeah.
I was actually in a reenactment with them.
Yeah.
But we have to continuously have, staff facilitated sessions to
Mhm.
work on that, because what we can't expect is for the clients to do all the work whilst we sit back and, type
No.
reports into a computer. Like, this is about full engagement from everybody.
Yeah. And Lisa Schwartz has a lovely thing as well about requiring like full presence, which is hard going, when you have people who have high needs and maybe a lot of chaos and are trying to draw out these responses. But the other thing, Catherine, that I was wondering about there is, the criminal justice system as well has this belief about it's all about behavior, and we must reduce the offending behavior and the antisocial attitudes and beliefs, and kind of create more victim empathy, or also like remorse for the communities that have been suffering because of this activity. But again, do they miss the point that the men in this case were also victims too? Their communities were victims too, and that there is, as you say, a lot of collective trauma that isn't even conscious. So if you don't process some of that at the body and the emotional level, you're not going to get into the cortex to plan for the future.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'd say two things about that. One is very easy for offenders to identify as an offender, because it really fits with the kind of masculine identity they've created for themselves. It's like,
Interesting. Yeah.
yeah,
So that's not a problem. That's not like
not a problem at all. They'll own that piece. But, being from putting on our trauma informed glasses, we see, everyone was a victim here. So
yeah.
that's where we need to begin.
Mm-hmm.
But in order for someone to get to a stage where they have a response ability, an ability
Yeah.
to take responsibility, to not be reactive, but be responsive, to get to that stage where that's actually authentically happening,
Mm-hmm.
where they're not doing it just for the purposes of parole, where
Mm-hmm.
they're doing it because they actually really experience through, and we need to have empathy with our own victim before
Mm-hmm.
we can really have empathy with the victim as that
Yeah.
we've perpetrated against,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, that can definitely be missing at times from the work. I think a lot of the work, the restorative practices work is very, very powerful,
Mm-hmm.
especially for lifers who've kind of done a kind of process of, reconciliation, with
Yes.
themselves over time, and, done so. But yeah, for it to really have meaning, I think we need to change the way all of that model is constructed.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. And on that, I do think myself that restorative practice and trauma informed or trauma responsive practice, they really blend kind of well, because they are about relationships and repair and kind of,
And shared power, I think, is a
yes.
really big part of that as well, so there's a real balance of power, which is lovely to see. And so, yeah, I think definitely we draw on a lot of their approaches to dealing with conflict and things like
Right.
that. So that's definitely informed some of the work that we do.
Super. Yeah, makes a lot of sense to me. And just on the work readiness,
Mm-hmm.
what types of barriers would you have seen presenting for any of the men really, but particularly, say, lads who've been in prison for a fair amount of time, maybe on really long sentences or multiple sentences, where, as you say, they might really want to become a worker, but
Mm-hmm.
aren't actually really work ready, or have never been really helped through the system to become work ready?
Yeah, so initially what you see in terms of the presentation is like this kind of hunger to make up for lost time, and I want to get out there and I want to get my career and I want to, there's guys I grew up with and I want to catch up with them, and it's all kind of ungrounded, aspirations. And that can be kind of an indicator that someone is pretty in risky territory, really, because you can feel that it's quite impulsive, that they take up on anything. And so really what you want to do is say, okay, let's just slow it down, spend some time here, and then let's see what happens during that process. Because for me, the results, and I know there's collective kind of obsession now within the industry for employment as the kind of key indicator of success. And so, and I was part of that too, absolutely. And now I'm looking at it more around what's your purpose?
Yeah.
Which
Gives
is
you
really
meaning.
brings you back into your body, doesn't it? That question, what do you think you were put here to do?
Yeah, I would love
What have all of the events in your life given you? Because that's a really unique education you've gotten. What can you offer the world because of that? What will bring you joy? And it might be that I want to be at home with my family. I've missed them for so long. Okay, well, if that's what brings you the most joy in life, let's help you do it. But you're doing it through conscious decision making.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's empowered decision making. It's not about, I don't have power, so this is my only choice.
Mm-hmm.
And then for a lot of people, it will be, I really want to, start my own business, or I'd like to work for someone. But it's, one of the casualties, which is really sad to see for people who've experienced like ongoing pervasive trauma, is their creativity dies. And I'm an artist myself, so I'm really kind of passionate about tapping into their and kind of lighting that fire again, resuscitating the creative spirit, because that's our life force, is creative.
Yeah.
Social enterprise in itself is all about creativity. It's all about like unique ways to solve social problems. Who should be solving them? You guys.
Yeah.
So,
I love it.
So it's all about like using all of their kind of power to be purposeful in their world, rather than, get gainfully employed.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes that's like, in Mr. Price or Dunn's or, and
not very inspiring, really, necessarily. Yeah.
When you have gone through the life that you've gone through and managed to get to this point, surely your purpose should be bigger than that.
Yes.
And to see them as so, like, statistically, they are like beating all of the odds by showing up here every day, by that part of them that's still alive. Imagine that hope, which is like such a rare resource, is still fueling their kind of motivation to get up every morning and show up, even when they feel like crap, even when their body is resistant. There's that hope is still driving them forward. Like, that's what we want to nurture. That's what we want to really build on. That's the kind of commodity that we want to expand upon, so that they feel like, okay, I'm more alive now than I was when I got up this morning. I feel more like I exist more, like I take up more space in the world. And then you begin to have a relationship with yourself.
Yes.
So,
yeah. That is a mysterious one. That's rarely an indicator in criminal justice reports that I found, a more kind of authentic sense of self or whatever, as opposed to these false selves and, frightening ones. But is there also, in kind of these very chronically deprived, dislocated communities, a difficulty with benefits, where you grow up where everyone is on the dole and in receipt of various necessary allowances and medical cards? Can that get in the way as well mentally, and for some people at least, in kind of thinking, I want to go out on my own into the world as a worker?
So the only kind of consistent need that was met was not by, you know, the kind of mother figure or caregiver, but by the government. So there is this over dependence where government actually takes on the role of family and community. And so everything is, they imagine the government should solve. I'm sick, what? It's the government's fault. It's, you know, it's like, I need services. It's like, well, then, you know, we should be looking at ways that we can provide them for ourselves in our own communities. But it's, yeah, it's that kind of brainwashing, deep conditioning that what I'm getting from the government is going to be the only thing that I can rely on for the rest of my life. And so you're asking me now to
do without it,
forsake that. And so, yeah, that takes a lot of work to do that. It is one of the biggest barriers. Like if we were to talk about the aspiration of work early on, you'll get a flat no. You know,
yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, or the medical card that goes with it, or the disability is like, it's like winning the lotto if you achieve disability. Like there's, and you can understand why. It's all about security.
Isn't it actually? Yeah.
All about security, yeah. So I think what the social enterprise does here then is just allow a kind of a graduation, a stepping stone into another safe place, but it's a step up. You know, the requirements are more, you go on a different payment. It's still a payment. You don't lose all your entitlements yet, but you're moving towards that. Because I suppose it all comes from a feeling of, will I be able to survive out there? Do I have what it takes to survive out there with no fallback?
On my own.
Exactly. Yeah. Without any kind of support. So, yeah, that's kind of, you know, why we really like to stay involved with, even with graduates who've gone on that we feel like will thrive. You know, there'll never be a time where we plug out of somebody's life. There will always, and even if after, you know, a couple of years they say, I'd like to change jobs, we'll help with that. We'll try to facilitate, you know, engagement with a different kind of employer, and so that they know that in the backdrop of all of this, you know, there is relationships there that will be there consistently.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's really important, especially in the absence of those, you know, nurturing family relationships to begin with. And just to come back to the body again, and the fact that these are men we're talking about, and the work is construction work, and the trauma is held in the body in various places. Do you think for some of the men that the heavy lifting, or at least some of the physical work, helps to kind of discharge some energy?
Yeah, absolutely. Like we know, you know, research tells us now that men's endocrine system needs physical work in order for them to release testosterone, which helps to motivate them. And without that, you see men, you know, very kind of apathetic and sleep a lot, and, you know, they don't know the difference between night and day. And so, you know, even just, you know, having that routine of getting up early in the morning, I put on a uniform, which is really, you know, a lovely thing for a man to do, to feel part of something, you know, this uniform that connects me with this group that I'm with, that I feel part of. And then I physically exhaust myself by making and creating things, which is what they do here. And I think, you know, for men, when we talk about, you know, the principles of creating safety and empowerment and decision making and choice and all of that, for men, it's about contributing to how this facility is built. So they actually play a role in that, you know. So, and as well as that, we like to give a really creative spin on it, so that they can be inventive and use some of their skills to come up with new ideas and be innovative in some of the curriculum. But yeah, that's really, really an important one when working with men in particular.
Yeah, thanks for that. And just one final one, Catherine. I ask everyone this type of a question. What do you feel decision makers, so again, our politicians, policy makers, people controlling the purse strings, can do to support safe, healthy, connected childhoods for all children, so that they can grow up to reach their full potential?
That's a big question.
Yeah, it is pretty massive. One or two ideas.
I think it comes down to, I've done a lot of work with families. I've done a lot of work with men who've kind of had histories of violence with their own children, and kind of restoration work with families. And I suppose it's all about education. It really is. Once women understand, the impact of their role as mothers on the development of the child, when they understand the developmental stages, like they take that up and like really, because women want to be better parents. They really, really do. But they're incredibly, under-supported, uneducated, and stressed. And so I think, having programs like Strengthening Families programs, running just in every community where we feel like there's severe deprivation, I think would be at a minimum a really fast way to see significant change happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Catherine.
Thanks so much, Jane. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, so have I. I've learned an awful lot. I could talk to you for days, Catherine. I know that much. We might have to reconnect down the line.
Yeah.
But we'll leave it for now. This has been Relationships Matter with me, Jane Mulcahy, and the wonderful Catherine O'Halloran from Limerick City Build. Thanks again, Catherine.